It's Sunday, May 25, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, our opportunity to dive deeper into subjects of US politics, society, and culture that rarely get enough airtime on the corporate media. Stories that end up as a 10-second soundbite can form the basis of an 80-minute conversation in this safe space. And it's my pleasure to speak each week to some of the great thought leaders and change makers shaping the American experience. Today, we revisit three of our most compelling speakers from this series: Professor Tim Snyder, Congressman Jamie Raskin, and Professor David Cay Johnston.
Well, his first election did not surprise me. I dropped everything I was doing because I saw an opening for him to get to the White House, and I warned that he wants to be our dictator. And Donald, who I've known for 36 years, I wrote about him becoming president in 1988, knows nothing. He's appallingly ignorant, and he's a con artist. He's the most masterful con artist I've ever seen, and I've exposed lots of con artists over my long career. His comeback surprised me. We don't know yet, because it'll take time for political scientists and political professionals to sift through the data. But I suspect the most important factor in his second term, that he won by a very narrow margin, 1.5 percentage points, is the drop in the number of voters. 13 million people. So if you had population growth, 17 million people didn't show up in this election. Well, they did previously. And of course, if people don't show up, it usually means either they feel they have no power, or they're satisfied with what's going on. And given that America, as the Economist magazine in Britain has pointed out, has not just the strongest economy in the world, but is the envy of the world under Joe Biden, this election result is surprising. On the other hand, America is a country now where half of adults read at the level of a fifth grade child. Half. And more than a fifth, around 22%, read at the level of an 8-year-old, a third grader. So people who don't have reading skills, don't have critical thinking skills, can be easily manipulated, and they have been. And there's plenty of surveys showing that, for example, journalism students at Northwestern University put this together. In those counties in America with no newspaper, there are 3,300 counties in America, and hundreds of them now have no newspaper. Trump's margin of victory was in the neighborhood of 80 to more than 90%. People don't consume news, and they just rely on the PR pitches that they're getting. Then you end up with a result like this, which is a very grave danger to our republic. We may not, as a democracy, survive Donald Trump's return.
Just as an aside, how does America remain a superpower if, as you describe, the people in it are increasingly uneducated? How much of the country being a superpower on the world stage relates to the actual the number of people who are part of it? Because again, to me, that just talks to the 1%, or it talks to big business and talks to the Elon Musks of this country, who are actually holding the controlling stakes.
Well, we live in a very complicated and competitive world. Knowledge is power. Fundamentally, knowledge is power. And, I've been teaching for the last 15 years. I taught law at Syracuse University. I'm not a lawyer, but I was on the faculty teaching law there for 15 years. And now I teach at Rochester Institute of Technology as a professor. And I'm astonished at how students these days do not know things that were basic requirements to get out of junior high and high school when I was in school in the 50s and 60s. It's amazing. There are surveys showing Americans are asked, on whose side did we fight in World War II? And the plurality pick with the Nazis against Russia. Just appalling ignorance about these things. And it's been going on now for quite a long time in America, that we have been dumbing down our education system. We've been withdrawing the arts. We kept football. And many schools no longer require students to read a novel. reading a novel is critical to understanding what sociologists call the other. It's a way to learn why and how other people behave, what motivates them. But many high schools now, even for honors English, don't require you to read a novel, or maybe one at the most. And I know of schools and of individual teachers who show movies instead. Now, if you and I both read Harper Lee's novel, Atticus Finch in each of our minds is a different person. But if we watch the black and white film, we get a pre-digested Gregory Peck. By the way, there are school districts where I live in Western New York that ban To Kill a Mockingbird because it's filthy.
So maybe we should talk just for a second about Trump's plan to deconstruct the Department of Education. This is a Christian nationalist decision, really, isn't it? This kind of comes from the Heritage Foundation, this idea that actually we can, in their desire to stop indoctrination, they want to indoctrinate in their own way.
Exactly correct, with one little caveat. Donald Trump has repeatedly called Christians fools, idiots, and schmucks, and he means that Yiddish word in the worst possible sense of it. He's not a Christian. He was asked on a radio show where I live 6 years ago or 8 years ago, when was the last time as a Christian you asked God for forgiveness? And Donald goes, what, forgiveness? Why would I do that? I've never done anything in my life requiring asking anyone for forgiveness, which should tell you all you need to know. But then you add in his repeated written and stated assertion that his life philosophy is a single word: revenge. Christianity utterly rejects revenge. You cannot call yourself a Christian honestly and believe in revenge. But the plan here, I think, is very, very clear. Attacking science, calling it a religion, asserting it's unverifiable, spreading messages like Dr. Fauci should be tried and put in prison because none of these 70-some virus vaccines in the United States was ever tested for safety and purity, which is pure, utter nonsense. The goal here is a top-down oligarchy run by white supremacists. Make America Great Again is really just cover for Make America White Again. And, over the years that I've covered Donald and known him, I've written many times about racist actions by him when he was a casino owner, as a landlord. His family has been steeped in racism from the get-go. And Donald on the campaign trail, at one point he pointed to a man and said, "That's my black man," as if he's property. Yeah. So the goal here is very, very clear. It's, in fact, indoctrinate people, take away access to things that would question abuse of power from the top. Don't let students read various books and novels. And from that, you can then remake the country into something unrecognizable as a democracy, but probably able to function just fine on an economic basis. China, after all, does it.
And the rest of the world is looking on in horror. Certainly the nations that are NATO member states, for example, who rely on the United States for their safety and for their security. And they are obviously concerned that maybe under the direction of Vladimir Putin, or who only knows who, Donald Trump will probably get to that end game of removing the US from NATO. Certainly that's how it feels. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think that Trump very likely will move to follow through. One of the reasons Trump didn't do a lot of things in his first term is that he is an incompetent manager. As soon as I arrived in Atlantic City in 1988 from the Los Angeles Times, his own executives were ratting him out to me as a complete and utter incompetent, and I very quickly established that, he didn't know anything about his own business. He owned 2 casinos, but he knew nothing about the business. And so Trump has created this faux impression that he's this great business genius. Anybody who understands business, and I had an appointment in a graduate business school for 8 years after I retired from the New York Times, knows that his 2 shows, Celebrity Apprentice and Apprentice, what went on there would just kill any business. That's not how business works. But why would most people know that? They'd have no idea whatsoever about how business works. And so Donald didn't follow through on many things, partly because there were some people who stood in his way and said, you really don't want to do that, or this or that will happen. But I think he now feels emboldened. The courts have bowed down to him. You can't legally deport American citizens, and yet they are openly talking about deporting American citizens. So I think we're at great risk that Trump will turn out to be an actual dictator. And one of the signs of that would be found in our Fifth Amendment to our Constitution. Most Americans think if the police arrest you, you have a right to contact your lawyer or your family and to have a court hearing. That's not true. The Constitution says the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in time of war or insurrection. Abraham Lincoln did it. And if Donald can find a way to create some violent response that's big enough, I can see him declaring this is an insurrection, suspending habeas corpus, which would allow him to arrest people he doesn't like and hold them incommunicado. And will the courts support that or not? Well, I don't trust this current Supreme Court majority. I trust lots of the judges Trump appointed to the bench. Many of them have turned out to be good judges. There's some awful ones in there, but many of them have been rooted in the law. But there are a number of things Trump can do that would diminish our democracy. The other big sign that we're going to become a dictatorship is if he starts firing generals and admirals and promoting officers out of turn, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels. That is one of the classic signs of an authoritarian government exercising control.
Well, he said he was going to fire any of the military that were involved in the withdrawal from Afghanistan because it was such a terrible operation in his opinion. So that could be the basis for that.
Well, he's also said that he's going to recall Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
If you're a U.S. military officer, you are subject to recall to the age of 70. Milley is in his 60s. Now, to court-martial him, he's going to need generals and admirals to go along with this, and I think he'll have a much tougher time with that, and therefore he may not do it. But understand, Trump doesn't understand anything about the Constitution. He had to have it explained to him when he was president why there is a memorial over the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. How you can grow up, not just in America, but where you did in the United Kingdom and not know about December 7, 1941 is astonishing and goes to how Donald is appallingly ignorant. So he has repeatedly said, I have an Article 2, that's the part of the Constitution governing the presidency. I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. It says nothing of the kind, but if that's what Donald thinks, he will behave that way.
And lowering the bar that allows Donald Trump to be president twice. I mean, this is, again, feeds his ego and his narcissistic personality disorder that he can kind of win a second term. It kind of lowers the bar for future presidents, doesn't it? Because ignorant people will be like, well, if he can do it, then maybe I could too.
After Trump was elected, I've been in office about a year, I did a worldwide tour about my books on Donald Trump. And the most interesting thing I heard back from any of the lectures was from a man in Germany who said, well, you Americans, you've been very lucky. You went 200 years without having an absolutely crazy authoritarian get to the head of your government. To those of us who live in Europe, you just got lucky and now you're catching up with the rest of us. And while it was terribly cynical comment, I thought, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. And of course, if you don't explain to people that your liberties depend on the liberties of people you don't like, then you're going to have a very hard time defending the liberties of the people. And Donald has no interest in the liberties of the people. He has said, you shouldn't be allowed to write something about me unless I approve.
And we've started to see that with the ABC News settlement, $15 million, because Trump was described as a rapist when he didn't like that description, despite the adjudicated rapist decision. This is just the beginning of this spiral, really, isn't it? Where the integrity of journalism, which of course he describes as fake news or the enemy of the people, this is going to come to a head in this next regime, isn't it?
Yes. ABC, we don't know exactly why ABC folded in the case they would have won.
Yes.
But ABC has many, many interests, including a television network beyond ABC. It has theme parks that can be subject to all sorts of federal regulatory interference and other interests.
We should remind people that ABC's parent company is Disney, and they also have government contracts, apparently.
Well, actually, Disney owns ABC.
Sorry, other way around.
The parent company is Disney. At one time, it was the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes, they have contracts with the government like Elon Musk and a number of other people. But I expect that Trump will bring civil actions against my former newspaper, the New York Times. They may bring criminal actions. They will do everything they can to harass and harry that newspaper. I also expect it will stand up, but everybody won't. We've seen that the publishers of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, and the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, killed editorials supporting Kamala Harris. Now, the editorial page belongs to the publisher. In my view, publisher is entitled to whatever he wants. You don't like it, that's fine. I mean, when I was an investigative reporter at the LA Times, there were mornings I woke up and there's an editorial in the paper that, without naming me, says, yeah, we don't think this is what's going on, and would dump on their own story. That's fine. They're entitled to do that.
Yeah.
Both publishers did allow the news departments to report on this robustly, but that doesn't mean that will continue. And the federal government's levers to bring businesses to knee is, I think, something Americans don't fully appreciate. Much of my career, I focused on regulatory law and how regulations you've never heard of take money out of your pocket or deny you things. And that machine can be used not just for good, not just for extracting money from people, that's an abuse of it, but it can also be used for government to punish and suppress corporations that don't bow down to Donald Trump. Voluntary obedience, which is what Disney did in the ABC News case, is one of the worst things you can do. It signals to other people that you're a coward. It signals to the oligarch or the dictator or the wannabe dictator that they have more power than they actually do.
So on that, David, let's talk about democracy in the US now, because I've been saying for a while that democracy has already fallen, and we've seen a lot of people have certainly said that this election didn't really feel like a proper election because of the disinformation campaign, the amount of money that people like Elon Musk spent on trying to buy votes, $1 million at a time in some cases. And also, going alongside with that, we have this rise of dictatorship, which also many Americans refuse to accept either. So is it American exceptionalism that prevents some people from accepting or acknowledging that democracy has fallen or can fall and that dictatorship can rise here?
Well, democracies all around the world have been in trouble for some time. When I was doing lots of lectures 15 years ago, I would tell the audience that there was this tsunami of authoritarianism building, and I felt like I was putting my hand up to stop it, which is, of course, totally useless. But what else is there to do? But when great social tides come along, they have to play themselves out. After the plague in Europe, the church losing its iron control of the populace, for example, that had to play out. And democracy requires people who are engaged about their government, who feel that they are citizens, not just occupants of an area. And yet both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan said in slightly different language, there's no society here. We're 300 million people occupying this territory in the United States. And that has weakened the connections and the bonds that allow people to work out their differences and reach compromise. And then, of course, Newt Gingrich in 1994, when he was House Speaker, popularized this idea that bipartisanship and cooperation is what he called political date rape.
And the tragedy is that we are almost now so polarized that it seems like we've gone beyond the point of no return?
Oh, I don't think that. I mean, after all, America survived a civil war. It survived having a murderous president of the United States in Andrew Jackson, whose portrait, by the way, Trump hung in the Oval Office when he was president.
Yeah, big fan.
We survived the Great Fear after World War II. This is not at all hopeless. And Trump didn't win by some huge margin. If Trump's economic policies do what I and other people who understand economics expect, which is make economic growth slow down or likely reverse, increase inflation, particularly for food, and start trade wars in which Trump seems not to appreciate that China and Mexico and Canada and others can retaliate against us, that should wake some people up, get some people to go turn out to vote. And so it'll take 2 years to get a new House. We could change the control of the Senate in 2 years, and it's a much better table for the Democrats in 2026 than it was this year. But we also could absolutely fail, and we can end up being a dictatorship. From the fall of Rome took 40 years. We have this misleading sort of belief in the modern world because of news that things happen right away. No, they don't. For weeks before the attack on Fort Sumter that began the Civil War in the United States, there were news accounts saying, when are they going to attack? When are they going to attack? This ship arrived today and these soldiers arrived, and when are they going to attack? These things don't suddenly happen out of nowhere. 9/11 didn't even come out of nowhere if you'd been paying attention to Osama bin Laden, but very, very few people do, and most of those were avid readers of the New York Times, which had reported about this.
The disconnect in this last election was that the economy was doing better on paper, but not in person. And so Donald Trump kind of seized on that and claimed that he'll bring prices down and he'll bring inflation down. He'll obviously take credit for Joe Biden's economy over the next 2 years because of the approximately 2-year lag on a lot of these policies. So is there going to be a wake-up call? Will there be buyer's remorse? I mean, how do you think that will play out when things do get more expensive and Donald Trump doesn't have control over them?
Well, I've been arguing that a smart strategy here is let Trump be Trump, LTBT, let Trump be Trump, because his policies won't work. They can't work. So let him do that, and people will pay the pain for not understanding and for not understanding how the economy works, how politics works. But it will take several years. I absolutely agree. Anything good will be claimed as the successes of Donald Trump. And people forget that under Joe Biden, the economy literally was much better. From 2022 to 2023, the median income, that's half make more, half make less. It's very typical of what people make as opposed to the average, which can be skewed way up because of people with literally multi-billion-dollar annual incomes, not wealth, incomes. The bottom half's income rose 20% faster than society overall. I do these numbers every year for 30 years. This is a sharp change where the bottom was gaining and the top wasn't. And but it takes years for things like that to play through. The decline of the 90% in America began in 1974 after a peak in 73, but we really didn't see the strong effects of that until more than 30 years had passed. So these things do take time. But Donald's authoritarian impulses in other areas, using the military as he's promised to do against American citizens, deporting American citizens, deporting students who protest on campus, those things probably will come back, hopefully will come back to wake people up to this loss of liberty and this notion that we're going to tell you what you can read, what products you can buy, what medical drugs and other medical interventions will be available to you. that over time shouldn't play particularly well. On the other hand, look, the American people have the right to overthrow their democracy and create a dictatorship. The Constitution has a method for doing it. You just over time change the government and change the rules. Hopefully people just aren't that gullible and dumb, but we don't know.
One day it's cool, the next I'm sweating through my clothes. I realized it's time to switch things up, and Quint's had exactly what I was looking for. Lighter layers, better fabrics, and prices that don't make you think twice. The best part, everything with Quint's is priced 50 to 80% less than you'd find at similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middleman, Quint's gives you luxury pieces without the crazy markups. And Quint's only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. My Quint's black t-shirts are my go-to every day, unless I'm in formal wear. Elevate your closet with Quint's. Go to quince.com/weekend for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/weekend to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/weekend. There's a lot happening these days. It can feel especially stressful or hopeless when things are outside of our control. But Calm can help you restore your sense of balance amidst outside chaos. Calm is the #1 app for sleep and meditation, giving you the power to calm your mind and change your life. Everyone faces challenges in their daily lives, and mental health isn't about a cookie-cutter approach. That's why Calm offers a wide range of content and programs to help you navigate the ups and downs of life, including meditation, sleep stories, sleep meditation, calming music, grounding exercises, and expert-led talks to help you handle grief, improve self-esteem, care for relationships, and much more. Calm puts the tools that you need in your pocket and helps you dedicate a few minutes each day to live a happier, healthier life. Stress less, sleep more, and live better with Calm. For listeners to the show, Calm is offering an exclusive offer of 40% off a Calm premium subscription at calm.com/weekend. Go to calm.com/weekend for 40% off unlimited access to Calm's entire library. That's calm.com/weekend.
My view is that universities are there so that we can have freedom as a country. Universities are the place where people not only learn how to question, but they have the time and the ability to learn with what they are going to question. So they can't just be not just against things and have that general sense of unease that comes with youth, but also have an idea what they're going to be for. And that takes place in the classroom. And I've been really happy, in my career to have thousands of really good students whom I've taught and from whom I've learned. But it also takes place during those 3 or 4 or 5 years when young people are relatively free. And among the there's this whole like parody of a joke of a campaign about free speech on campus. I mean, sure, I can tick off problems of free speech on campus. My classroom was actually interrupted by actual communists twice, which I think is probably not true of any of the right-wing people who talk about this stuff so much. But like compared to the real world, right? Compared to the workplace, compared to the most of the rest of the ways that these kids are going to spend their lives, campus is where they are free. And that's why campus is targeted, right? And protests in particular. We should all be protesting. Everybody should be protesting. I mean, it's a First Amendment right, but also you should just be doing it because if you're in favor of something, you should be acting in favor of that something. And historically, campuses are a very important place for that to happen. So, I mean, my analysis of what's happened is that regardless of what one thinks about Israel-Palestine, and there are many reasonable views one can hold, it's wrong to take any issue and say, this is the issue which is so important that we're going to use it to ban protest on campus. Because if you ban protest on campus, then you're setting the stage for banning protest generally. You're associating protest with criminality. And that's what happened in 2024. And that set us up for a bad 2025 because it makes it harder for people to protest on campus. And in general, I mean, what else do I think? I think the whole anti-Semitism thing is ridiculous and a sham, and it discredits the term. The idea that anybody in the history of the world is going to, in order to protect Jews, is going to shut down universities is just ridiculous. Like, that is not a thing that happens. If you're going after universities, that means you are going after Jews. It's pretty much as simple as that. I'm not saying that there are no anti-Semitic people doing anti-Semitic things in universities or in the world. Of course there are. I'm not even saying anti-Semitism is not a growing problem. It definitely is. But the idea that the heartland of anti-Semitism is the university is absurd. The idea that actual American anti-Semites look at the news and they say, oh yes, the federal government has gone after Columbia. They've struck a blow against us. I mean, that's just grotesque, right? For an actual anti-Semite, Columbia means New York. Columbia means Jews, right? Like, it's just all dumb. And the media, I think the media has made a big mistake in even just accepting that framing that this somehow had to do with combating anti-Semitism. It doesn't. It's about fomenting anti-Semitism. When you say that we're doing this because the Jews made us do it, right? You're fomenting anti-Semitism. When you deport Muslims and others who haven't committed any crimes, you're provoking something. You're provoking something very bad. So that's basically my view on what's happening. The universities, Harvard is right to sue. The universities are right to get together. That's what I've been trying to advocate from the very beginning. They have to work together because otherwise they'll be picked off one after the other. And Harvard is absolutely right to go on the offensive because the stuff the federal government is doing is breach of contract on their side. It's illegal on their side. They're violating all kinds of laws in order to do this. And we should take the time to point that out. So yes, that's my view.
What about the fact that Trump is blurring the line between support for Palestinians and support for Hamas? That is, again, something that the media hasn't really jumped on. And yet, claiming that somebody who set up a pro-Palestinian demonstration is actually pro-Hamas with no evidence. I mean, that's pretty tough for people, isn't it?
Well, it's a basic violation of the principle on which this country was supposed to be built, namely that we are all individuals. So if I'm an American and that means I have to be, that means I'm responsible for the Iraq War, or I'm an American and therefore I'm responsible for Trump deporting people illegally to El Salvador, right? Or I'm an American, therefore I'm responsible for us overturning governments in Latin America, right? That's not the way that the rule of law works. The whole point of the rule of law is that you have rights and responsibilities which are defined individually, and so that game that they're playing where they say, okay, this person looks differently than you, so maybe he's a Palestinian, and if he's a Palestinian, then maybe he supports Hamas, and if he supports Hamas, then maybe he's a terrorist, and if he's a terrorist, then maybe he's not deserving of due process, right? And that thing that I just did in 10 seconds, they do in like 3 seconds. And so you shift immediately from a rule of law framework into a state of exception framework, which is a fascist framework. And I think it should be called out as such. The moment that you're taking individuals and you are not just oppressing them, but you are publicly terrorizing them, right? So the way that they're doing this with ICE, they could just, it would be wrong for them to just take the visas away and send an email. But they're not just taking the visas away. They're taking the visas away and not sending an email so that these people can be grabbed on the streets, so that ICE has the opportunity to have videos made, right? And that's a deliberate act of terror. So, it's not too much to say that this administration claims to be fighting terrorism, which is what the Hamas invocation is supposed to, it's supposed to be us against the terrorists. They claim to be fighting terrorism, but what they are in fact doing is they're spreading terror. When you're using, a foreign country and its concentration camp, when you're taking people by force in the middle of the day who haven't violated any law, you're not even accusing of having violated any law. You're not giving them any due process. You're claiming that they don't deserve due process because I said so, basically. Those are acts of terror, right? Those are acts of terror. And it's not the first time that acts of terror have been justified by just claiming that other people are terrorists. That's the way that it generally works.
You're describing that video of Romea Oturk that we all saw. She jointly wrote an op-ed in the Tufts paper, a few years back. That video, as you describe it, kind of went around the world, went viral for the horror associated with that. But there are an awful lot of people, sadly, I don't know if it's 77 million, but potentially, people who are like, yeah, good, get rid of them. What do you say to those people and to that rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can. Look, there are two registers, right? I mean, there's a register that we're talking in where I point out analytically how that's wrong or what it is. That's that kind of filmic fascism is deliberately there to create a sense of us and them. Like we were talking about before, it's deliberately there to say, okay, you're safe because you're not a foreign graduate student, but you should tremble a little bit because who knows, maybe tomorrow you won't be safe. And that's how you govern, right? Or rather, that's how you rule. You're putting away government and instead you're ruling. But how do you talk to people? I mean, I think that's a different question. And I think you have to talk to people more in terms of let's like start with the individuals. Let's start with the individuals. Let's give them their names. Let's talk about their backgrounds. Let's talk about what they were trying to do, what their whole trajectory of life was. Let's try to generate a little bit of a sense of empathy. And then let's also talk about what it means when you accept the exception. So, okay, you might like that this person was taken off the street. You probably wouldn't want for everybody to be taken off the street. But if you're accepting the exception, then you're also making a rule. And if it's okay for you this time, that means it's also okay for you next time, which means it's going to be okay for you all of the time. But I'm summarizing conversations like that would actually you have to spend a lot of time on those conversations, and you probably have to do a little bit of listening, uncomfortable listening as well to have those conversations. But it's also an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to talk about what the country actually is for, because going back to your first question about the checks and balances, the inspiring part of the history of this country is taking this notion of personal liberty, which goes way back, but taking it and making it ever more legal, making it ever more ramified, making it ever richer. But in the end, it all comes down to the notion that we have a certain dignity, and in my view of freedom, that dignity should be allowed to flourish, but also that dignity has to be recognized. And if we don't recognize dignity, then we're not a land of the free, right? So if a young woman can't walk down the streets of Boston, Massachusetts without masked people taking her stuff and putting her in the back of a car, then we're not recognizing her dignity. And the moment we're not recognizing her dignity, we're also saying, well, we're the kinds of people whose dignity we don't ourselves recognize, right? We're not the kinds of people who are taking part in that grand, risky tradition of talking about freedom and trying to make it ever more legal and ever more real in society. We're something else. We're doing something else.
A lot of Jewish conservatives voted for Donald Trump. Their argument, as I understand it, is that he's great for Israel. How do you decipher that? To me, there's it's almost as if people have had to suspend their allegiance in one way in order to support him in another. And do you think those people, in light of recent events, are having buyer's remorse?
I mean, I'm not a conservative Jew who voted for Donald Trump, so my capacity for describing the psychological twists and turns of all that is limited. I mean, I would just instead try to kind of break the links of that chain a little bit. The idea that Trump is good for Israel is supposed to mean that Trump, what does it mean he's good for Israel? It means that he's good for a certain version of Israel. And then the question is, and then I think you have to ask the question, is that the right version of Israel? Or more basically, is that the only version of Israel, right? Like, is the Netanyahu order the only possible Israel we can have, right? Is propping up Netanyahu, who is one of many rulers around the world who is ruining the rule of law in his own country because of his own misdeeds. Is that the right kind of Israel, or is it the only kind of Israel, right? I mean, Netanyahu so divided his own society and so disrupted his own government that the terrorist attacks of October 7th were possible. And then in an utterly predictable response, which I did in fact predict, they have to use overwhelming force against the Gazans to make it a war, right? To make it an indefinite war, a war without end, which has many causes, many consequences. But one of them is that it makes Netanyahu's power plausible indefinitely. Is that the best possible Israel? Is that the only possible Israel? And is putting America's power on the side of that status quo the only thing that could be done in order to express goodwill towards Israel or more broadly towards the Jews? I dare to think not, right? I dare to think there are other possible Israels. In fact, there have been other possible Israels. I'd like to think there will be a better Israel than this kind of indefinite Netanyahu in power forever version of Israel. And also, I dare to think that there's a difference between like preserving a particular set of Israeli rulers and the good of Jewish people generally, right? And and I'm not alone in that. That's a view which is widely held among Jewish people and people who aren't Jewish. So I mean, the good on Israel kind of comes down to like good for the Jews, and I just think there are links in that chain which don't really hold up. And I want to just repeat something which I said earlier. I am firmly convinced that this attack on the universities is anti-Semitic, that it's directly anti-Semitic, and that the faster people realize that, the more useful this is going to be. And that the fact that that they use the word anti-Semitism to justify attacking universities, that is itself in a very deep way bad for Jews, because it takes anti-Semitism, which is a real problem in the real world and one that is getting worse, and turns it into a bureaucratic instrument by the federal government to disrupt higher education. In other words, it nudes it of meaning and it trivializes it. And that is a very bad thing, I think, for pretty much anybody who, is concerned about the future of Jews. Trivializing anti-Semitism, weaponizing it is not even the right word. It's trivializing it. They don't need to weaponize it. They're attacking the universities anyway. What they're doing is they're using the occasion of attacking the universities, which is something they want to do anyway, to also trivialize anti-Semitism while they're doing it. And both of those things are bad.
There's also the desire potentially to disband the educated. So shutting down the Department of Education at a kind of elementary level, but also going after the universities. I mean, this is a theme of dictatorships, isn't it? Is to try and have your citizens as uneducated as possible, and therefore they will be more compliant. Do you think there is a connection there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one could have a whole conversation about that. I think that's what you've done is just a wonderful piece of contextualization, because, you're talking to a university professor, and so I can get all excited about the universities, but that's only really a piece of the whole story. I think there are at least two other very big pieces, probably a bigger piece, and one which precedes Trump, but which is being accelerated under the present Secretary of Education, is the privatization of public schools. So much more important than Ivy League schools, obviously Ivy League universities is the American public school system. And the American public school system is the engine of meritocracy, or always has been anyway. And what they've done is, and again, this is a misuse of the idea of freedom. They've taken the idea of freedom to mean that what should in fact happen is that everybody should pay taxes so that, I'm simplifying a little bit, not much. Everybody should pay taxes, but instead of getting good public schools, those taxes should allow richer people to have a discount on tuition for private schools, which is basically what it comes down to. So in school districts like the ones where I'm from, or where my family is from in Ohio, they've all got, it's sad to say, but it's sad to say, I hate to say this so directly, but the schools have all gotten worse. And a lot of kids have been pulled out of the system and are being educated by parents, which is not, again, sad to say, not generally a good idea. Like, I'm a pretty well-educated parent, and I don't think that I should be responsible for the education of my children. And the public schools are now, like, they don't have, they're dropping phys ed, art, music, and then in the next wave they drop foreign languages, English, until you get down to a situation where it's clear that the public school system is basically becoming like low-level tech prep for people who are not supposed to have the American dream, right? They're supposed to be stuck where they are forever. And that's not a side effect. That's the object of policy. They're not supposed to see anything else that could happen to them. And meanwhile, the people who already have money and can send their kids to private schools, those kids maybe have some chance of social mobility, or at least staying where they are. So the socioeconomic picture is that they're trying to freeze into place the existing economic order. So whoever is wealthy now is going to be okay. But if you're not, no upward mobility for you forever. And the third piece of it, after the universities and the public schools, is science. So, I mean, the United States becomes a superpower by borrowing other people's scientists, by having universities, by having national labs, by having freedom of inquiry. And all of those things are now under attack. And it's not just science as an institution, it's also science as a way of seeing the world. When we have these prominent people who are not just of such capacious ignorance, but of such demonstrable ability to say things that are anti-scientific at the top of the government, that has an effect on everybody else. So we're pushing ourselves towards a society where, it's not just the universities, it's learning itself and science itself, right? So it's what they're engaged in, as I see it, and I haven't had time to write about it, but that's how I see it, is a process of de-enlightenment. They're trying to take the society and they're trying to take reason out of it. And the possibility that comes with reason, the possibility for human change that comes with reason, they're trying to remove that.
And if we reference Project 2025, 900 pages of this kind of mandate for leadership, there's also a religious kind of element to this too, is that by removing the education and replacing it with some kind of Christian nationalist education and putting religion either back into schools or, as is currently happening, teaching people at home and homeschooling children to become Christian soldiers for Trump, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think the freedom of religion is very important, and I think it's very important for us to take religion seriously as a fact of people's lives. But it's a great mistake to violate the basic principle of the First Amendment and to directly or indirectly use state power to sneak religion into education or to use it as a substitute for education, because these are just not the same things. And it's a violation of what the founders were trying to do, but it's also a violation of common sense to imagine that taking kids out of public schools and instead giving them religious instruction just by anybody is an education. And that, what I just said is not any kind of exaggeration. That is what is in fact happening.
Well, Trump said this week, I'm bringing religion back.
Yeah. That's, the idea, that's the easy point to make, is that, what kind of Christians are these people? But that point is so easy, I'm not even going to make it. The institutional point is that, everybody has the right to adhere to religion, and that's really important. And issues of faith are really important. But what nobody has the right to do is to deny children the possibility of learning and take that time away from them and replace it with some adult sense of religion. That's what nobody has the right to do. And that is what is happening day by day. At the level of the states, it's becoming easier and easier to do stuff like have buses come to public schools, take kids away, drive them to a church or even somebody's house, play some kind of game, which is of zero educational value, and then take them back to school. And you're basically just denying these kids their right to learn in the ages when they can learn, when they're young. You're taking those hours away from them. You're taking their social mobility away from them. And it's, in the name of religion, which I find very sad.
When you start a podcast, it seems like you have to figure it out all by yourself. Scripts, setup, filming schedule, logos. It can be super overwhelming, and every day seems to introduce a new decision that needs an answer. When you're starting off with something new, it seems like your to-do list keeps growing every day with new tasks, and that list can start to begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything can be such a game changer. And for millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the e-commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. You can get started with your own design studio with hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Accelerate your content creation. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend. Shopify.com/weekend.
There are elements of different historical episodes, and there are even elements of different kinds of movies that play in here. And I don't think that what we're seeing now is an exact replica of anything, whether it's Pinochet's Chile or Orban's Hungary or Putin's Russia or Orwell's 1984 or, The Handmaid's Tale. But it's its own thing, but it does evoke very serious resonances from authoritarian disappearances in fasciste countries like Argentina during the Dirty War or Chile under Pinochet, where people are just swept off the streets and disappeared and deported. And, what's different here is we've got a resilient, independent judiciary, and we've got a public that is increasingly emboldened to speak out. And I can't tell you what a boost it was to the Democratic Party and people in Congress, as well as the country generally, to have millions of people last Saturday marching and rallying all over the country against this authoritarianism. Very, very big deal.
Let's talk about the law effectively, or certainly their argument for ignoring the Supreme Court order that said that they should facilitate the return of Kilmar, for example. Their interpretation of the word facilitate has been very interesting, to say the least. And you posted on Blue Sky that, clearly they can't read. Just tell us, how far they have gone in this moment to reinterpret the Supreme Court's ruling and the lower court's ruling on the return of this young man.
I mean, it's essentially a fascist approach to the rule of law. I mean, they lost at the district court level. They lost at the circuit court level. They lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court. The court emphasized the fundamental importance of due process and said facilitate the return of these people to the country. So now they obsess over the word facilitate. Is that something less than guarantee or mandate or ensure and so on? Any commonsensical reading of what the Supreme Court said is obvious. That the court is telling us, bring him home, facilitate his return to the country. And by the way, this is a contractual arrangement between the United States and El Salvador. They've got some kind of agreement. Now, they haven't given us the text of it yet, but there's an agreement where we're paying them $6 million, and then they're taking these, I don't even know what you call them, these human beings, these people that we're sending them, these deportees. Well, if that's the case, they're our agent. We are in a contract with them. And so the idea that we can't get someone back that we've sent them erroneously by the administration's own admission is preposterous.
And, having the El Salvadorian president in the Oval Office, there was a perfect opportunity to do the right thing and to do a kind of public pronouncement to say we made a mistake and Kilmar will be returned. But we had totally the opposite of that. We had effectively two dictators cozying up to each other, egging each other on to be more authoritarian than the other. And we even heard Trump on a hot mic say, it's the homegrowns next, which he's referring to U.S. citizens that he feels deserve to be in an El Salvadorian gulag. I mean, this is not the stuff to joke about. This is very deadly serious, isn't it?
I mean, it looked like a meeting of a bunch of Batman villains to me, chortling about how they're taking over Gotham City, rather than leaders of democracies. It made it very clear how they are deliberately defying the orders of the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, which Donald Trump bragged of packing and stacking and gerrymandering to his liking so he could overturn Roe versus Wade. And that, of course, happened in the Dobbs decision. But even that Supreme Court so tilted in a Trumpian direction that they invented a completely new doctrine out of whole cloth to create presidential immunity from prosecution for felony crimes committed under the auspices of the office. Even that court told him, you've got to honor due process. We don't have the rule of law without due process because anybody could be swept up in the same situation Mr. Obrero Garcia was swept up in and deported. And if you say, well, wait a second, I'm a law-abiding citizen, I'm an Eagle Scout, they say, we're taking you somewhere else. You can't tell it to the judge because we're not bringing you to a judge. And so that is authoritarianism.
How much of what they're doing is theatrical, as in to put the fear of God into people? Because this is the playbook of the fascist leader, isn't it? Is to try and set an example with certain individuals so that people do live in fear. Do you think that we, need to be conscious of that play that he's doing?
Yeah, but I think that just makes it worse. In other words, they are truly trying to arrogate to themselves this power to sweep people off of the street and to send them to foreign countries without due process. They are completely thumbing their nose at the Constitution. The fact that they're totally aware of the spectacular theatrical cinematic television effect just makes it worse. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump, he is a man of television. He's certainly not a man of books. He knows what effect it will have, and that's what they're looking for. That's why they wasted millions and millions of dollars originally, sending people off to Guantanamo Bay in those ridiculous air flights with like 3 or 4 people. So it's all a made-for-TV movie from his perspective.
With Kristi Noem in the cosplay and the guns, and again, it's almost as if they're all such unserious people, but their actions are extremely serious.
Well, I mean, Kristi Noem's a good example because let's say that she went to do her photo opportunity, which was grisly enough in front of all the prisoners behind bars. What if she had been taken into the prison? What if there'd been some kind of administrative error there?
Right.
That would Donald Trump be taking the position we couldn't get her back? Would the president of El Salvador be saying there's nothing we can do? It demonstrates what a fraud this is, that they're claiming that they're powerless to do anything.
Let's talk about the justification for the removal of certain individuals, and Mahmoud Khalil is an example, who was involved in a protest at a university, pro-Palestinian, not pro-Hamas. That's how they've positioned this. And they're using anti-Semitism as an excuse to go after people. And I think, certainly there are people in Jewish communities who are fearing scapegoating as Trump is invoking anti-Semitism to justify these crackdowns. But as I see it, Trump is as much an anti-Semite as anybody. I mean, he pretends to be a supporter of the Jewish people, maybe so he can cozy up to Benjamin Netanyahu over the war in Gaza because he's so anti the Palestinians there. But when it comes to the US, do you feel that there is this kind of false narrative about anti-Semitism?
Well, let's start with just the legalities of that case. It seems very clear that in the case from Columbia, as with the case from Tufts, that there are people who are here lawfully on student visas, although I believe Khalil might be a permanent resident.
Yes, he is.
Double check my math on that. But these are people who are lawfully present in the country. They're being deported for no reason other than they wrote an op-ed taking a position on one side or another of the Gaza war, or they attended a demonstration. But these are people who were never charged criminally with anything. Violent assault. I mean, under the First Amendment, we think of the dividing line is between speech and expression, no matter how much this or that party disagrees with it, and violence. And none of those people was ever charged with violent destruction of anything. I believe, I might be confusing my cases, but at least one of the people facing deportation is a nonviolent activist who views himself in the tradition of Dr. King, and cites King and Gandhi and so on. But in any event, none of these people have been charged with violence. They're just being charged essentially with political incorrectness, that they are somehow at odds with the position taken by Donald Trump. Now, it's cheering to see that you've got Jewish student groups at Columbia, and some of the members say they agree with Khalil about what his position on the Gaza war. Many were saying they disagreed with his position on the Gaza war. They say that's wholly irrelevant. He was just engaged in freedom of expression. And in fact, he was one person who constantly denounced violence and rejected violence and intimidation and threats, and spent a lot of time trying to bring people together to actually talk about the convoluted and impacted politics on campus around the Middle East. He was trying to disentangle it all. And so Jewish students are standing up for these people, saying, don't violate their rights. Don't violate their free speech rights. Don't violate their rights under the Immigration Naturalization Act, their rights on their visas. Don't violate their rights in our name, is what they're saying. And I find that impressive, and another example of courage. Just like Harvard University standing up this week saying, sorry, we're not going to allow the federal government to take over our university. And as a graduate of that school, I felt very proud of Harvard doing that, understanding what all the risks are.
But it requires all the universities to take the same position, as it should have done with the press in the White House press briefing room when they kicked out the Associated Press. I mean, everybody's scattered. There was no connection between any of the media in that moment, which would have been the right thing to do. And
as with the law firms as well. I mean, You would think of all these institutions we're talking about, the law firms would understand the fundamental primacy and importance of everybody standing together on behalf of the rule of law and not scurrying off to make a deal, no matter how afraid you are. But the law firms that hung tough have, of course, gotten court orders telling the president of the United States he does not have the power to ban people from federal buildings or courthouses or security clearances because he doesn't like someone who used to work with them, or he doesn't like a position they've taken. No, that is not within the powers of the president, and it violates the civil rights and civil liberties of citizens who are lawyers.
Is it that Trump doesn't know the boundaries and the jurisdiction that he has, or he's purposely flouting it, or is it that he is surrounded by sycophants who, as opposed to the last administration that he ran, who told him no back then, he's surrounded by yes people? How much of it do you think is him chancing it, or just being completely naive to his role?
There you're asking me a question about psychology.
It's a mental health question.
I am no expert there, but and Donald Trump has been likened to a lot of different people in history, from Mussolini on the political side to Herbert Hoover on the economic side. I will tell you who he most reminds me of. When I was growing up, we had a comic book. I think it was in the Archie family of comic books, called Richie Rich. And it was about a little boy who was super rich from a very wealthy family, and he felt he could get away with anything, any kind of mischief or malice. But in the end, common sense and people's compassion prevailed over this little Richie Rich character. And I think he's never grown up, out of that sense of absolute invincibility and untouchability because of his great wealth. And, the framers of our country were afraid of great disparities of fortune. Certainly Tom Paine was, because he understood that would give people this sense of, divine or superhuman powers over everybody else. And, one person, one vote under equal protection is the model for American democracy. We all have one vote. We all have one voice. And no, the fact that you have $1 billion or $50 billion does not entitle you to different treatment under the law.
And historically, dictatorships always fall, which I suppose is good news. We just have to get to that point. And this week, it was announced that a court order meant that the press room had to invite the AP and Reuters back into the room, not on a kind of rotation, but actually they're allowed to be there now, which I suppose is a sign that they are following the law in some ways when there is enough pushback.
I think that's right. It's going to be a game of cat and mouse with these people because, Trump, if you look at him historically, and he's had literally thousands of cases, civil and criminal cases, about half as a plaintiff, where he's suing people from his casinos, or business partners, what have you, or, ABC or CBS, and half where he's being sued by painters and plumbers and small business contractors, former mistresses, women who allege he sexually abused or raped them, and so on. He's been to court a lot. We have to assert simply that there are certain standards of conduct in society. We will hold people to the law, but I would hope that leaders in America actually could be held to even a slightly higher standard than just not committing crimes against people, but actually trying to use the government as an instrument for good for everybody. That's what we have to try to get back to.
What gives you hope in this moment that the people are responding to this regime?
But when I was growing up, my dad used to say to us, when everything looks hopeless, you are the hope. So I grew up with that sense of guilt, Anthony. But I am finding millions and millions of people out there who regard themselves as the hope, and they understand that they've got intellectual resources, social, cultural, financial, emotional resources that other people maybe don't have. And they can help other people who are in an even more desperate situation, as a lot of immigrants are now, and some of the college students are now, and a lot of the federal workers whose jobs and livelihoods are on the line, and all the people that those federal workers serve. But I look to hope, to the past, because prior generations of American democratic patriots have stood up against the Alien and Sedition Acts, like at the end of the 18th century. They stood up against slave masters and slavery and the violence of the Confederacy, and they stood up for civil rights against Jim Crow and racist sheriffs, and stood up for women's rights. And, the founders of the law school where I used to teach, American University's Washington College of Law, they chained themselves to the White House. Emma Gillette and Ellen Spencer Mussey fighting for the 19th Amendment. And so, we are a product, we are the heirs to these civilizing movements that have transformed America. Obviously, from what we're seeing today, we're not an exceptional country because we're somehow immune to fascism or racism or authoritarianism. We're an exceptional country because we have sufficient democratic space and will to always defeat the fascists and defeat the racists and the Jim Crow bosses and so on. And so that's the process that is continuing today. And I'm deriving a lot of hope from Indivisible and Move On and Do the Most Good and all of the great groups out there that are fighting every single day for our democracy and freedom. And finally, I'm getting hope from the young people. And my whole campaign has turned into a project for young people called Democracy Summer. And they come and they learn about these movements that have transformed American life. And then they understand what their role is today in fighting for everybody's right to vote and statehood for people in Washington and Puerto Rico. And they see the fact that democracy is always an unfinished project. It's not just a static collection of laws. It's a process in motion, and they're part of that process. And the young people are stepping up and fighting. But we know that there's a political war for the soul of young America. And so I'm proud that I'm going to be engaged in that process with a bunch of my colleagues, including Andy Kim over on the Senate side, this summer, as we get more than 1,000 young people across the country working for democracy and freedom.
Thank you for that, because I think that's what we needed to hear. For now, Representative Jamie Raskin, thank you for joining The Weekend Show.
The pleasure was all mine.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll be back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.